Imagine looking at a map of the world a long time ago. To the west, there was a small, rainy island, just a tiny spot off the coast of Europe. Not many people lived there, it didn't have many resources, and its armies were much smaller than the big, powerful countries nearby. But somehow this little island, Britain, took control of a huge piece of land 20 times bigger than itself. This land, India, had been home to empires for hundreds of years. Hundreds of millions of people lived there. It had many languages, religions, and traditions that were much older than Britain itself. How was this even possible? To most people back then, it would have seemed crazy, even impossible. India wasn't just one kingdom that could be easily defeated. It was like a puzzle made of many different societies, kingdoms, and empires. Many of them were richer and had stronger armies than any single European country. From the green river valleys of Bengal to the dry highlands of the Deccan, from the protected cities of the Marathas to the important city of Delhi itself, India was like a whole world on its own. For an island across the ocean to one day call India the jewel in the crown of its empire seemed like a fantasy. But it happened. The British didn't take over India in one big attack. They didn't conquer it just by having bigger armies. Their victory happened slowly, bit by bit. It happened through trade as much as through war, through making deals as much as through battles. They came first as traders, looking for pepper and nutmeg, cloves and cinnamon, the spices that changed the way Europeans cooked, made medicine and created perfumes. Only later did they become rulers. The story of Britain and India actually begins not with the sound of war drums, but with someone signing a document. But what happened in the end was shocking. By the middle of the 1800s, British control spread across the entire land. What followed brought both big changes and terrible results. Indian farming was reorganized to help British factories. Old leaders lost their power. New movements for independence began. And terrible famines hurt many generations. India became both the showpiece and the problem of the British Empire. It proved how far Britain's power reached around the world. But it also became the place where resistance grew, resistance that would one day help destroy the empire. But before we talk about rebellion and resistance, before we get to the railways and telegraph machines, we need to go back to the beginning. To the cold December of 1600, when Queen Elizabeth I signed a document that would quietly start the most important business enterprise in world history. At the time, it seemed like just a normal business deal with merchants looking to make money. But in reality, it was the first thread in a huge story that would tie two civilizations together for hundreds of years, often in painful ways. This is the story of how Britain conquered India, not all at once, but step by step, deal by deal, fort by fort. A story of ambition, competition, betrayal, and strength. Most importantly, it's a story of how a nation that was divided from within became weak, enough for outsiders to take control. The story of Britain's conquest of India can be traced back to a single piece of paper sealed with royal wax. On New Year's Eve 1600, Queen Elizabeth I put her name on a royal charter. This gave a group of merchants the right to trade with the East Indies. Few people at the time could have imagined how big this moment would become. On the surface, it was a simple document, just a license to do business, nothing more. But in reality, it was the birth certificate of what would become the most powerful corporation in history, the English East India Company. These merchants weren't nobles or government officials. They were ambitious businessmen who saw profit where others only saw danger. The charter gave them complete control over English trade in Asia. It basically handed them the keys to a fortune in spices, textiles, and valuable goods. To Europeans, the East was a place of endless wonders. Nutmeg was said to cure the plague. Cinnamon and pepper were worth more than gold. Silk and cotton were made with a quality that Europe couldn't match. People desperately wanted these items, and whoever controlled them could become unbelievably wealthy. But Elizabeth's signature didn't make England the master of Asian trade right away. Far from it. The Dutch had already gotten ahead of them, with fleets that were much bigger and better organized. The Portuguese, who had been there since Vasco da Gama's famous voyage, controlled important ports from Goa to Malacca. The Spanish, though they were stretched thin in the Americas, were still powerful. The French would soon arrive as well. In this crowded field, the English seemed like the weakest competitors. Their new company didn't have much money, didn't have many weapons, and relied on the goodwill of kings who weren't even sure it would succeed. But the East India Company had two weapons that would prove to be winners: patience and persistence. At first, they didn't even try to go straight to India. They were focused on the Spice Islands, today's Indonesia, where nutmeg and cloves promised quick riches. In those early years, the Indian subcontinent was less of a target and more of a stopping point, a place to resupply ships and set up outposts on the way to the real prize. The company's first voyages were dangerous. Storms, disease, and rival fleets threatened disaster. Many ships didn't return, but the voyages continued. Each one built experience, contacts, and money. Here's the interesting thing about the East India Company. It wasn't born from some grand plan to build an empire. It was born from merchants' hunger for profit. The British government didn't want to spend money on expensive overseas wars, especially in the early 1600s when England itself wasn't secure. What Elizabeth and her advisors did understand, however, was the power of business as a weapon. If England couldn't defeat its rivals with armies, it might outlast them through trade. The Charter of 1600 was more than just a business gamble. It was a strategic experiment. And though the company's early years weren't glorious, the seeds it planted would grow in ways no one could predict. Its warehouses, ships, and careful relationships with local rulers slowly wove threads of influence that decades later could be pulled into chains of power. The merchants who gathered in London on that winter night probably celebrated their new business with little more than dreams of pepper and silk. Yet with Elizabeth's stroke of a pen, they had been given not just permission to trade, but the license to change history itself. On that cold New Year's Eve, an island kingdom lit the first spark of an empire that would one day stretch across the Indian subcontinent. The East India Company started with its eyes on the East Indies, the islands of present-day Indonesia, where nutmeg, cloves, and mace grew in groves so valuable they were worth more than silver by weight. But the company quickly discovered that in these waters they were no match for the competition. The Dutch, with their powerful fleets and organized trading system, pushed the English aside. They blocked ports, threatened rulers, and took complete control of the spice trade with ruthless efficiency. By the mid-1600s, the English found themselves driven out of the East Indies completely. What seemed at first like failure, however, opened a new path. Forced to look westward, the company turned its attention to India, not as a rest stop on the way to Indonesia, but as a destination worth staying in. India offered something the Spice Islands couldn't: abundance, variety, and permanence. Its textiles, cotton dyed in brilliant colors, muslins as fine as mist, silks fit for royalty, captivated European markets. Its pepper, ginger, and indigo found ready buyers. Unlike the fragile control of the Spice Islands, India's wealth was vast and could be renewed. In 1640, the East India Company got permission from a local ruler to have land on the Coromandel coast. On this sandy stretch of southern India, they built Fort St. George, a simple fortress at first, little more than walls and warehouses. Yet it represented something new: Englishmen owning land in India, not just trading with permission from local powers. Around the fort, merchants, craftsmen, and workers gathered, and soon a town began to grow. This small outpost would blossom into Madras, today's Chennai, home to millions. The company learned quickly that forts were more than military strongholds. They were seeds of settlement. From Bombay on the west coast to Calcutta in Bengal, new trading posts rose, each surrounded by walls, guns, and busy markets. Unlike the Portuguese, who often seized their ports by force, the company negotiated, persuaded, and sometimes bribed its way into staying permanently. To local rulers, these Europeans seemed harmless, useful traders who brought silver and bought textiles, more dependent on Indian goods than Indians were on them. Few could have imagined that these tiny settlements would one day serve as the starting points of the empire. It was wealth, not conquest, that drove this stage of expansion. Spices, once the obsession of Europe, were gradually overshadowed by India's textiles. To wear calico or muslin became a fashion statement in London and Paris. Historian Brian Gardner once wrote that wealth could be measured in spices. But by the 1600s, wealth was increasingly measured in cloth. In Europe, to give someone Indian fabric was to offer both luxury and status. This trade reshaped the world. In the markets of Madras, weavers worked to meet European demand. In London, fortunes were made as ships unloaded bales of Indian cotton. And in between stretched the arteries of the empire, sea lanes patrolled by the Royal Navy, harbours fortified against rivals, and the first whispers of a global economy. Yet the British weren't alone. The French, Dutch, Danes, and Portuguese all had their own settlements, forts, and factories. Each power courted local rulers, competed for influence, and occasionally clashed. The Indian subcontinent, with its divided politics and immense wealth, became a theatre not just of trade, but of rivalry. The forts and settlements that dotted its coasts were like chess pieces, small by themselves, but capable of shaping entire contests. The East India Company, still a merchant business at heart, had no plan to become a ruling power. But every fort they built, every treaty they signed, every soldier they hired, nudged them one step closer to empire. In the Indian subcontinent, business and conquest would soon prove inseparable. Before Britain's footholds grew into power, India was already ruled by one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen, the Mughals. Founded in the early 1500s by Babur, a descendant of both Timur and Genghis Khan, the Mughal Empire blended Central Asian military traditions with Persian culture and Indian statecraft. By the mid-1600s, under emperors such as Akbar and Shah Jahan, the Mughals controlled most of the subcontinent, ruling over more people than any European king could even imagine. To step into Mughal India was to enter a world of dazzling wealth and cultural brilliance. The Mughal court in Delhi and Agra was famous across continents. Palaces glittered with gemstones, craftsmen created miniature paintings of exquisite detail, and poets wrote verses in Persian and Urdu that celebrated love, conquest, and the divine. European travelers were astonished not only by the empire's riches, but by its order. Roads and canals connected provinces, huge caravans carried goods, and the imperial government, though imperfect, was more sophisticated than most European governments of the same period. The Mughals had perfected the art of balancing power. Local rulers, or zamindars, collected taxes in exchange for loyalty. Religious diversity was tolerated, especially under Akbar, who experimented with blending traditions of Hinduism, Islam, and even Christianity into what he called the Din-i-Ilahi, or religion of God. The empire's ability to bring so many peoples into one political order was unmatched in much of the world. The Mughal economy was the envy of Europe. India produced nearly a quarter of the world's wealth during this period. Its cotton, silks, spices, and indigo dominated global trade. Cities like Surat and Bengal's Dhaka buzzed with commerce. Their ports were filled with ships bound for Arabia, Africa, and Southeast Asia. When the first English merchants arrived, they were dwarfed by the scale of Indian production. Europe needed India far more than India needed Europe, and yet the grandeur of the Mughal world was more than material. Its cultural legacies remain among the most recognizable symbols of India today. The Taj Mahal, completed in 1648, under Shah Jahan as a tomb for his wife Mumtaz Mahal, still rises like a marble dream over the Yamuna River, a reminder of the empire's ambition to turn stone into poetry. Gardens, mosques, forts, and paintings testify to a civilization that saw no contradiction between power and beauty, But even as the Mughals flourished, cracks were forming beneath the surface. The empire's reliance on constant conquest to keep revenues coming in created strains. Rulers after Akbar struggled to command the same loyalty across diverse populations. Religious tolerance gave way under rulers like Aurangzeb to more rigid policies, which upset large parts of the empire's Hindu majority. The sheer size of the empire made it vulnerable to rebellion, overextension, and foreign threats. Still, in the 1600s, the Mughals seemed unshakable. To the English traders huddled behind their walls at Madras or Calcutta, the Mughal emperor was less a rival than a distant son, too far above their reach to challenge, and yet history has a way of shifting balance. Empires that seem eternal can fade within a generation. The Mughal order, which had given India relative stability for nearly 2 centuries, would not collapse overnight. But its slow decline would open space for ambitious newcomers. When the British Company began securing land, forts, and influence, it wasn't because they overpowered the Mughals directly. It was because they arrived just as the Mughal world was beginning to fracture. To understand how Britain rose, we must now turn from the empire at its height to its gradual unraveling, an unraveling that would change the destiny of India itself. By the beginning of the 1700s, the glittering Mughal empire that had once dazzled the world was beginning to dim. Its palaces and gardens still stood. Its armies still marched. But the connections that held the empire together were fraying. The decline wasn't sudden. It was slow, uneven, and sometimes invisible to those living through it. Yet with each passing decade, the authority of the Mughal emperor became more symbolic, while real power slipped into the hands of provincial governors, ambitious generals, and local chiefs. The causes of this decline were many. The empire's huge size strained its government. A system built on conquest needed constant victories to sustain itself. And when conquest stopped, so did revenues. Aurangzeb, the last great Mughal emperor, expanded the empire to its largest size, but exhausted its money and army in the process. His strict religious policies, aimed at enforcing Islamic law across a diverse population, upset many Hindu nobles and rulers who had once been loyal allies under Akbar's more tolerant rule. Resentment grew quietly, and rebellions became more frequent. Then came the external blows. In 1739, the Persian ruler Nader Shah stormed into India. At the Battle of Karnal, the Mughal army was decisively defeated. Days later, Delhi itself was attacked. Nader Shah's soldiers swept through the capital, stealing its treasures and leaving the city in flames. Among the stolen items was the legendary Peacock Throne, encrusted with jewels, and the Koh-i-Noor diamond, symbols of Mughal majesty carried off as prizes of war. Delhi's streets ran with blood, and the emperor, once master of a subcontinent, now looked powerless even in his own capital. Barely a decade later, another invader followed. Ahmad Shah Durrani, the Afghan conqueror, launched repeated invasions into northern India beginning in 1748. His armies swept across Punjab and beyond, seizing territory and shaking Mughal authority further. Each invasion exposed the fragility of a once proud empire. The emperor remained in Delhi, a figurehead, while his authority carried little weight outside the city's walls. The weakening of the Mughal center had deep consequences. Governors of distant provinces, Bengal, Hyderabad, Awadh, began acting independently, collecting taxes for themselves and keeping private armies. In effect, the empire splintered into semi-independent states that still paid symbolic tribute to Delhi, but were Mughal in name only. The empire's prestige lingered like an echo, but the sound grew fainter with each passing year. For India's people, the decline of the Mughals wasn't just a political drama, but a lived reality. Peasants faced heavier taxes as local rulers sought to enrich themselves. Banditry spread along trade routes. Merchants, once confident in the security provided by imperial law, now found themselves negotiating with regional warlords instead of a single empire. The grand dream of a united, prosperous Mughal India was slipping away. Yet in this chaos lay opportunities for others. New powers rose from the empire's ruins. The Marathas in the Deccan, the Sikhs in Punjab, the kingdom of Mysore in the south, all carved out their own realms. Each sought to fill the void the Mughals left behind. But this political fragmentation also opened doors for outsiders. Where once a powerful emperor might have dismissed foreign merchants as minor irritants, now European companies found themselves courted as allies, financiers, or military backers in the endless rivalries of Indian states. The decline of the Mughals didn't mark the end of India's story. It marked the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter in which foreign traders could gradually transform into conquerors. And in this shifting landscape, the East India Company, once an anxious guest at the fringes of empire, began to see possibilities that no one had imagined a century earlier. As the Mughals weakened, the vacuum of power wasn't left empty for long. Rising from the rugged hills and fortresses of the Western Deccan came a new force, the Marathas, what began as a local resistance movement under the legendary Shivaji in the 1600s, evolved into one of the most formidable powers of 18th century India. Unlike the centralized, wealthy Mughal court, the Marathas built their strength on mobility, resilience, and a loose confederacy that could strike across the subcontinent with astonishing speed. The Marathas were, in many ways, the opposite of the Mughals. Where the Mughal emperors relied on grand architecture and courtly ritual to project power, the Marathas excelled in guerrilla warfare and swift cavalry raids. They were deeply rooted in the land, drawing on local loyalties and a warrior tradition that emphasized endurance and adaptability. Their forts, perched on rocky cliffs or hidden in forests, were symbols of resistance, each one a thorn in the side of would-be conquerors. By the early 1700s, the Marathas were no longer just raiders. They had forged an empire that stretched across much of central and western India. From their stronghold at Pune, they projected authority over vast territories, extracting tribute from weakened Mughal governors and rival kingdoms. Their armies rode deep into Bengal, Gujarat, and even up to Delhi itself, at times dictating terms to the very emperors who once ruled them. But the Marathas weren't a single kingdom. They were a confederacy of powerful chiefs, each controlling their own region, but united in common cause. This structure gave them flexibility, but also planted seeds of division. Rivalries between Maratha leaders often flared, weakening their collective strength at critical moments. Still, for nearly a century, the Marathas stood as the dominant Indian power, overshadowing the fading Mughals. For ordinary Indians, the rise of the Marathas was both hope and hardship. To some, they were liberators from oppressive Mughal taxation. To others, they were yet another power demanding tribute. Their campaigns brought both prosperity and plunder. Farmers might see Maratha horsemen defending villages one season and demanding grain the next. In 18th century India, loyalty was fluid. Survival often depended on the shifting alliances of local rulers and warlords. It was into this fractured landscape that the Europeans stepped with growing confidence. The Marathas, despite their strength, never fully united India under their banner. Their energies were spent on expansion, on extracting revenue, and on fending off rivals. They fought bravely against foreign intruders, but never recognized the danger posed by the seemingly small outposts of the East India Company. To many Maratha leaders, these merchants were useful partners, sources of silver, suppliers of weapons, and occasional allies in regional wars. Few realized that behind their trade agreements lay a more dangerous ambition. The Marathas' story is one of both triumph and tragedy. They proved that Indian states could rise to challenge even the great Mughals. Yet their inability to unite power across the subcontinent meant that when the true test came, not from Delhi, but from London's merchants, they would be divided. In the end, their rise was also a prelude to their downfall. The very decentralization that made them strong would one day make them vulnerable. As the 1700s unfolded, The stage was set for a three-way contest: the remnants of the Mughals, the rising Marathas, and the increasingly bold East India Company. And in this contest, the balance of power would tilt in ways few could have foreseen. By the mid-1700s, the East India Company had undergone a transformation. It was no longer just a group of merchants chasing spices and textiles. It was becoming something more dangerous. Across India's fractured political map, the company's leaders recognized a truth: trade alone couldn't guarantee survival. To defend their warehouses, forts, and contracts, they would need soldiers. And so a corporation began raising an army. At first, these forces were modest, little more than hired guards. But over time, the company organized them into disciplined regiments trained in the European style. Indian recruits, called sepoys, were drilled with muskets, bayonets, and the tactics of British infantry. European officers commanded, while Indian soldiers filled the ranks. What began as protection for trade became, in effect, a private army, loyal not to the British Crown, but to a corporation whose headquarters sat thousands of miles away in London. The funding for this military came not from taxpayers, but from business itself. Profits from cloth and spices were invested in muskets, cannons, and fortifications. Money from newly acquired territories was diverted into paying soldiers' salaries. The company had stumbled upon a formula that gave it both the means and the motive for conquest. Trade paid for war, and war secured trade. The company's army quickly grew larger than many European armies. By the 1760s, it numbered in the tens of thousands, overwhelmingly Indian in composition, yet European in discipline and structure. This hybrid structure gave it a unique edge. Against rival Indian states, the company could deploy modern military formations, artillery, and naval support, tactics that few Indian armies could match. Against rival European companies, it could field more men, transported and supplied by the unmatched strength of the Royal Navy. The sea, too, was Britain's silent ally. While the French and Dutch struggled to send reinforcements across vast oceans, the British Navy ensured that troops, supplies, and silver could flow steadily from London to Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay. Ships that carried textiles back to Europe returned loaded with muskets and cannons. No other European rival could match the consistency of this supply chain, but perhaps the company's greatest weapon wasn't its cannons or fleets, but its policy of pragmatism. Unlike some conquerors, the British didn't demand immediate submission from local rulers. Instead, they presented themselves as partners, willing to trade silver for goods, willing to rent out troops for local conflicts, willing to sign treaties that seemed to preserve sovereignty. Many Indian rulers, beset by rivals and rebellions, found it convenient to invite the company into their affairs. And once invited, the company rarely left. This policy masked the true nature of the company's power. It wasn't conquest by open declaration, but conquest by gradual entanglement. Each alliance, each treaty, each garrison placed in a ruler's territory pulled India one step closer into the company's orbit. By the time many realized the cost of these partnerships, it was too late. The sepoys stood at their gates, the company's cannons faced their walls, and debts owed to company financiers bound them hand and foot. In the span of just a few decades, the East India Company had transformed itself from a merchant guild into a sovereign power in all but name. Its private army was not only the largest corporate military force the world had ever seen, it was the spearhead of Britain's advance into India. By the mid-1700s, the Indian subcontinent wasn't only a battleground for local dynasties. It had also become a stage for European rivalries. Britain wasn't alone in its ambitions. The French, Dutch, Danes, and Portuguese each maintained forts, settlements, and fragile alliances with Indian rulers. To them, India wasn't simply another colony. It was the prize of a global empire, a place where fortunes could be made and wars decided. Of these rivals, the French posed the greatest threat. The French East India Company, backed by Paris and operating from strongholds like Pondicherry, was determined to carve out its own empire. French officers brought with them not only trade but military expertise, drilling Indian troops and deploying European artillery on Indian soil. At times, the French even seemed poised to eclipse the British. In the 1740s and 1750s, during the War of Austrian Succession and later the global 7 Years' War, French and British soldiers fought not just in Europe and the Americas, but in the villages and fields of southern India, for Indian rulers. This rivalry presented both danger and opportunity. Princes and nawabs quickly learned that European companies could be played against one another. Some allied with the British, others with the French, depending on who offered the most favorable loans, weapons, or promises of military support. The subcontinent became a chessboard where European powers moved pieces, but Indian kings still chose many of the rules. Yet behind this contest loomed one figure who would tip the balance: Robert Clive. Clive wasn't born to nobility. He was the son of a struggling lawyer in England, sent to India as a clerk in the company's service. But in the heat of conflict, he revealed a ruthless brilliance. He reinvented himself from clerk to soldier, from soldier to commander, and from commander to kingmaker. His boldness and willingness to gamble on risky moves would transform the company's fortunes. Clive's rise coincided with Britain's broader naval supremacy. While French troops could fight valiantly in India, their supply lines were fragile. British ships, protected by the Royal Navy, moved reinforcements, muskets, and silver across the oceans with greater reliability. It was this combination, the cleverness of men like Clive and the logistical machine of Britain's fleets, that gradually tipped the balance of power. The rivalry wasn't limited to battles in India. In the Caribbean, in North America, in Europe itself, Britain and France were locked in a global contest. India was simply one front in a much larger war, a war that would decide which European empire would dominate the 18th century world. For the East India Company, victory in India wasn't merely about profit, it was about survival against a French competitor, just as determined to control the subcontinent's riches. The Dutch and Danes, though still present, increasingly faded into the background. The Portuguese, once supreme in Indian waters, clung to their old ports like Goa, but no longer set the pace of events. The true duel was now between Britain and France, and India was its proving ground. In this proving ground, alliances would shift, betrayals would occur, and battles would be fought that would change not only India's destiny, but Britain's as well. On the horizon loomed a confrontation in Bengal that would alter the balance of power forever, the Battle of Plassey. And at its center would be Robert Clive, the unlikely clerk turned conqueror. On the humid plains of Bengal, in June 1757, a battle unfolded that would change the destiny of a subcontinent. Yet to call Plassey a battle almost feels misleading. It wasn't a clash of equal armies struggling to the death, but a carefully arranged drama of scheming, betrayal, and ambition, where the East India Company proved that victory in India could be bought as much as it was fought. At the time, Bengal was one of the richest provinces in the world. Its fertile fields produced rice and opium. Its workshops spun muslin and silk, and its ports carried goods across Asia and Europe. Control of Bengal meant control of immense wealth, but the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, was no friend to the British. Alarmed at the company's growing power and their unauthorized fortifications at Calcutta, he sought to limit their influence. When he marched on the company's settlement, the British response was swift, and Robert Clive was chosen to lead it. Clive knew the odds. On paper, the Nawab's forces numbered tens of thousands, far outnumbering the few thousand company troops and sepoys under his command. Yet Clive also understood something crucial. In India's fractured political landscape, loyalty was rarely absolute. The Nawab's court was divided, riddled with jealousies and rivalries. Among his commanders was Mir Jafar, a general nursing grievances and ambitions of his own. To Clive, Mir Jafar wasn't just a potential ally, he was the key to victory. In the weeks leading up to Plassey, Clive engaged in secret negotiations. promising Mir Jafar that if he betrayed Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the company would make him the new Nawab. Gold, power, and titles were offered. Betrayal became inevitable. When the two armies faced each other on June 23rd, the outcome was already half decided. The Nawab's soldiers vastly outnumbered the company's men. But when the fighting began, Mir Jafar and his faction stood still, refusing to fight. Confusion spread through the Nawab's camp. The company's artillery, though limited, was well placed, and the sudden onset of a summer storm soaked the powder of the Nawab's cannons, while the British carefully protected their own. As the skirmish unfolded, Siraj-ud-Dowlah's army collapsed into disarray, his supposed allies watching in silence. Within hours, what might have been a decisive defeat for the company turned into a stunning victory. Siraj-ud-Dowlah fled the field, later captured and executed by forces loyal to Mir Jafar, true to their word. The British installed Mir Jafar as Bengal's Nawab, a ruler in name, but in practice a puppet of the company. It was a turning point of almost unimaginable scale. A private corporation thousands of miles from home had toppled one of the richest rulers in India through a mixture of cunning diplomacy, bribery, and battlefield discipline. The consequences of Plassey rippled far beyond Bengal. With control of its revenues, the company gained access to unprecedented wealth. This money wasn't only used to finance trade, it bankrolled the company's growing army, paid for new fortifications, and funded further campaigns across India. For the first time, the company could sustain its military machine without constant infusions of money from London. India itself would pay for its own conquest. British rivals looked on in shock. The French, once nearly equal contenders, never recovered from their failure to secure Bengal. Indian rulers, meanwhile, began to realize with alarm that these Europeans were no longer mere merchants. They were kingmakers, capable of deciding thrones and rewriting destinies. And at the heart of it all stood Robert Clive, the man who had gambled everything at Plassey and won. He returned to Britain, hailed as a hero, though his legacy in India was already stained with corruption and controversy. For the millions of Bengalis whose resources were now siphoned into the company's coffers, Clive's triumph marked the beginning of a new era, an era in which Bengal's prosperity would be drained to fuel Britain's rise. The Battle of Plassey wasn't the largest battle fought on Indian soil, nor the bloodiest, but it was perhaps the most important. It was the moment when the East India Company ceased to be merely a trading corporation and became unmistakably a ruling power. The cannons at Plassey had barely fallen silent when the true significance of the battle began to unfold. What Robert Clive and the company had won in Bengal wasn't just a victory, it was a fortune, a foothold and a foundation for an empire. With Mir Jafar installed as the new Nawab, the East India Company found itself in possession of something unprecedented: direct influence over one of India's wealthiest provinces. Mir Jafar's throne rested entirely on company support, and the price of that support was huge. He was forced to pay immense sums in gifts and concessions, transferring treasure, land, and trade privileges to the company and its officers. Chests of silver, gold, and jewels, some of which had sat in Mughal treasuries for generations, were carted off into company vaults. The private accounts of Clive and his fellow officers swelled overnight, fueling both admiration and scandal when news reached London. But the wealth of Bengal wasn't a one-time windfall. More important than the immediate plunder was the stream of revenue that followed. The fertile fields of Bengal fed millions. Its weavers clothed much of the world. Now those revenues no longer supported a Nawab or an emperor. They financed a corporation's ambitions. The company could pay its sepoys, expand its fortresses, and send ships and soldiers farther into the subcontinent, all with Indian wealth. Bengal, once a jewel of Mughal prosperity, became the financial engine of British expansion. This transformation occurred against the backdrop of global conflict. The 7 Years' War, 1756, 1763 raged across continents, from Europe to North America to the Caribbean, and India was one of its critical battlegrounds. Britain's victory at Plassey aligned with its broader naval and colonial successes. When the war ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, France's global position was shattered. The French East India Company, already weakened, collapsed within a few years. Though France retained small enclaves in India, Pondicherry, Karaikal, Chandanagar, these were little more than symbolic. The dream of a French India was gone. For the British, the war and its treaties confirmed what Plassey had foreshadowed. They were now the dominant European power in India. No rival could match their combination of naval strength, financial resources, and political cunning. From this point onward, Britain's main adversaries in India would no longer be other Europeans, but Indians themselves. Yet with power came corruption. Company officials, once clerks and traders, now wielded authority over millions of subjects. Many used that authority to enrich themselves, extorting local rulers and controlling trade. The sudden influx of Bengal's wealth into London created both fascination and unease. Members of Parliament debated whether a private corporation should be allowed to wield such unchecked power. Some hailed the company's triumph as proof of British genius, while others warned that greed was eroding both morality and governance. For Indians, the consequences were immediate and deep. Bengal's economy, long balanced between farming and craft production, was increasingly restructured to serve company profits. Taxation grew harsher, trade was distorted, and the once thriving weaving industry began to decline under the weight of British demands and European machine competition. In villages across Bengal, peasants began to feel the heavy hand of a new kind of rule, not the distant authority of an emperor, but the cold, extractive logic of a corporation. Plassey had opened the gates, and the Treaty of Paris had locked them behind Britain. What had begun as trade was becoming an empire, and the East India Company, a merchant guild turned ruling power, now held the keys to India's future. But Bengal was only the beginning. To the west and south lay powerful states, Mysore, Hyderabad, and the ever-resilient Marathas, that would not yield so easily. And as Britain pressed further into the Indian heartland, it would find itself tested in wars far bloodier than Plassey. The conquest of Bengal gave the East India Company immense wealth and confidence. But it wasn't enough to secure India. Beyond Bengal's fertile plains stretched kingdoms and confederacies still powerful enough to resist foreign intrusion. To become more than a coastal power, the company would have to march inland into the Deccan, the Central Plateau, and the heartland of Indian politics. The first serious challenge came from the south. The kingdom of Mysore, under leaders like Hyder Ali and later his son Tipu Sultan, emerged as a formidable foe. Unlike many Indian rulers who treated Europeans as helpers, Mysore's rulers understood the scale of the threat. Hyder Ali reorganized his army with European-style training, imported French advisors, and built up a formidable cavalry and artillery corps. His son Tipu went even further, experimenting with rocketry and fortifying his realm with modern tactics. For the first time, the company faced an Indian power that could fight it on nearly equal terms. The Mysore Wars, stretching from the 1760s to the late 1790s, tested the company's resolve. Victories were hard-won, and defeats reminded the British that India's fate wasn't yet decided. The battles around Seringapatam, Mysore's capital, became legendary, sieges of smoke and cannon, of betrayal and valor. Tipu Sultan, remembered by later generations as the Tiger of Mysore, resisted British advances with unyielding determination. His eventual fall in 1799 marked not only the end of Mysore's independence, but also a chilling signal to other Indian rulers. Even the strongest could be brought low. To the north, the Marathas still dominated vast stretches of central and western India. Their cavalry raids swept across the plains. Their leaders extracted tribute from Delhi, and their confederacy remained the greatest Indian rival to British ambitions. But like the Mughals before them, the Marathas were divided. Chiefs competed for influence, and rival factions weakened their ability to present a united front. In a series of wars known as the Anglo-Maratha conflicts, the company exploited these divisions, aligning with one faction against another, always maneuvering to expand its influence. By the early 1800s, after decades of shifting alliances and brutal campaigns, the Marathas too had been forced into submission. Further east lay Hyderabad, ruled by the Nizam, another powerful kingdom with ambitions of its own. At first, the Nizam tried to balance alliances between French and British interests, playing one off against the other. But after Plassey, rulers sought military support and found themselves bound by treaties that drained their independence. The Nizam's court retained splendor and ceremony, but real authority increasingly bent toward Calcutta and London. Behind these campaigns stood not just generals, but policymakers. The Wellesley brothers, Richard Wellesley, as Governor-General of India, envisioned nothing less than the systematic expansion of British authority. He introduced the infamous subsidiary alliance system. Indian rulers could keep their thrones only if they accepted British troops within their territories, paid for their upkeep, and gave up control of foreign policy. On the surface, this arrangement seemed protective, but in truth, it reduced proud kings to clients of the company. Richard's younger brother, Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, famous for defeating Napoleon at Waterloo, honed his military skills on Indian soil. Campaigning against the Marathas and Mysore, he forged the discipline and tactical genius that would later make him Europe's most celebrated general. India was in many ways his proving ground, and his victories added another layer to the company's expanding dominance. By the early 1800s, the map of India had been transformed. The Mughals were reduced to shadows in Delhi. The Marathas were fractured. Mysore lay crushed, and Hyderabad existed under British shadow. What had begun as a series of forts and warehouses was now becoming an empire, in fact, if not yet in name. The company's banners flew over an ever-growing swath of the subcontinent, yet this expansion wasn't without cost. Villages groaned under new taxes to fund armies. Farmers watched harvests diverted to company coffers, and artisans saw their livelihoods eroded by the flood of British goods. The push into the heartland was not only a military conquest, but an economic and social upheaval. And while Britain celebrated victories in India, discontent among its new subjects simmered quietly, waiting for the moment when it would erupt. While Mysore and the Marathas had tested the company in the south and center, another formidable power was rising in the north. In the fertile plains of Punjab, watered by the 5 rivers that gave the region its name, a new empire emerged under the banner of the Sikhs, led by the charismatic and iron-willed Maharaja Ranjit Singh. The Sikh Empire would stand as one of the last great Indian states capable of resisting British expansion. Ranjit Singh, known as the Lion of Punjab, united the fractured Sikh Misls, independent warrior clans, into a single disciplined state at the turn of the 1800s. Unlike many rulers of his age, Ranjit Singh was practical. He modernized his army with the help of European advisors, equipping it with artillery, muskets, and even cavalry trained in European drill. His court at Lahore became a symbol of both military power and cultural richness, where Persian poetry, Punjabi tradition, and Sikh spirituality intertwined. The Sikh Khalsa army was unlike any other in India, fiercely loyal, highly disciplined, and infused with the religious fervor of the Sikh faith. It embodied both spiritual devotion and military might. British observers, used to seeing Indian armies break before disciplined volleys, were struck by the Khalsa's cohesion and courage. To many in London and Calcutta, Punjab became both a source of admiration and anxiety. For decades, an uneasy balance held. The British, fresh from subduing the Marathas, eyed Punjab warily, but hesitated to provoke open conflict. Ranjit Singh, for his part, maintained careful diplomacy, acknowledging British strength while guarding his own independence. The Sutlej River became the informal boundary between British-held territory and the Sikh Empire. Trade and envoys crossed the line, but armies did not, at least not yet. The death of Ranjit Singh in 1839, however, shattered this balance. His successors lacked his authority, and court intrigues eroded the stability he had built. Factions vied for power. Palace conspiracies turned deadly, and the once unified Khalsa found itself manipulated by ambitious nobles. The British, ever alert to weakness, saw their opportunity. The First Anglo-Sikh War erupted in 1845. It was one of the most brutal conflicts the company had yet faced. The Sikh soldiers fought with a ferocity and discipline rarely encountered in India. At battles like Ferozeshah and Sobraon, the Khalsa inflicted shocking casualties on British forces. Eyewitnesses described the fighting as some of the bloodiest of the century, whole fields littered with bodies. British officers stunned at the sheer determination of their opponents, yet discipline and valor were undermined by betrayal. Some Sikh generals, caught between loyalty and their own ambitions, withheld support at crucial moments. The company, with its superior logistics and navy-backed reinforcements, ultimately prevailed. The war ended in defeat for the Sikhs, but it wasn't total. Punjab remained semi-independent under British supervision. That independence didn't last. In 1849, after the Second Anglo-Sikh War, Punjab was formally annexed into the company's growing domain. The Khalsa was dismantled, Lahore fell, and the once proud Sikh Empire was extinguished. The annexation marked the final great conquest of the East India Company. From the Himalayas in the north to Cape Comorin in the south, from Bombay to Calcutta, Britain now held sway over almost the entire subcontinent. For the company, the defeat of the Sikhs was both triumph and warning. The Khalsa had shown that Indians could match European discipline when united under strong leadership. For the Sikh people, the memory of resistance lingered long after annexation, becoming a wellspring of identity and pride in later generations. The conquest of Punjab completed the company's expansion. But with new lands came new problems: how to govern such vast territories, how to tax and regulate millions of subjects, and how to reconcile rule with the simmering discontent that was beginning to spread. The age of conquest was ending. The age of rule and of rebellion was about to begin. By the middle of the 1800s, the East India Company had transformed from a trading corporation into the effective ruler of India. Its flags flew over Bengal, Bombay, Madras, and now Punjab. Its treaties bound Hyderabad and countless princely states. Its sepoy armies patrolled plains and fortresses alike. Yet the company was never meant to be a government. It was a corporation driven by profit, answerable not to the people it ruled, but to shareholders in London. And this truth shaped the way India was governed. The company's administration began with revenue. Conquest had been costly, and armies had to be maintained. To pay for this, the company introduced sweeping taxation systems, often harsher and more rigid than those of India's fallen empires. In Bengal, the permanent settlement of 1793 locked peasants into a system where landlords, or zamindars, collected rents on behalf of the company. At first, it promised efficiency. In practice, it led to crushing burdens on farmers who now owed fixed payments regardless of harvest failures. Famine struck with greater severity because taxes rarely eased, even when fields lay barren. Trade, too, was reshaped to serve Britain's interests. Indian artisans, once the envy of the world for their silks, muslins, and cotton, saw their livelihoods collapse under the flood of British factory-made cloth. The same railways and shipping routes that promised progress also carried cheap industrial textiles from Manchester and Birmingham into Indian markets, undercutting local weavers. Entire weaving towns like Dhaka, once famous for its fine muslins, fell into decline. Villagers who had once spun thread for global markets were now reduced to subsistence farming or debt. The company also sought to impose legal and administrative reforms. British courts and codes of law were introduced, intended to create uniform justice, but often undermining local traditions and practices. English education was promoted among the elite, producing a small but influential class of Indians who could serve as clerks, translators, and minor officials. While some welcomed the new learning, others saw it as a threat to established religious and cultural orders. Religious and social policies deepened these tensions. The company proclaimed neutrality in matters of faith, yet its actions often contradicted this claim. Missionaries, though not officially endorsed, operated with growing confidence under British protection, spreading Christianity in regions long defined by Hinduism, Islam, and Sikhism. At the same time, reformist governors like Lord William Bentinck sought to ban practices such as sati, the immolation of widows, and to regulate child marriage. While these reforms were hailed in Britain as signs of progress, many Indians perceived them as intrusions into sacred traditions, an assault not only on customs but on community identity. Among Indian elites, disillusionment spread. Princes found their autonomy reduced by subsidiary alliances that drained their treasuries and filled their courts with British advisors. Noble families that had once enjoyed Mughal patronage lost their lands or saw them reassigned to company loyalists. Even those who prospered under British rule, merchants, financiers, and some landlords, felt a growing unease. They profited from the company's order, yet they too recognized the foreign hand that now dictated the rhythms of Indian life. For ordinary people, company rule was felt most acutely in the village. Taxes pressed hard, soldiers recruited from peasant families were sent far from home, and new systems of land ownership disrupted centuries-old ties between farmers and communities. Railways and telegraphs were beginning to connect India together, but they served primarily to move troops swiftly and extract resources efficiently. The promise of modernization was inseparable from the reality of exploitation. To the British public, the company's empire was presented as a civilizing mission, an experiment in governance, progress, and reform. But in India, the experiment looked different. It looked like wealth siphoned abroad, traditions unsettled, and a population caught between admiration for modern innovations and resentment at their cost. The East India Company had mastered conquest. Now it sought to master rule. Yet in doing so, it planted the seeds of resistance. For every law passed, every tax collected, every reform imposed without consultation, resentment deepened. Beneath the surface of apparent stability, the embers of rebellion smoldered, waiting for a spark to ignite them. By the 1850s, beneath the outward order of British rule, discontent was spreading like cracks through stone. On the surface, the East India Company's empire seemed secure. Ports stood strong, railways extended farther each year, and sepoy regiments drilled with clockwork discipline. But underneath, resentment was coiling tightly, drawn from economic hardship, wounded pride, and fears that Britain intended not just to govern India, but to remake it in its own image. The economic strains were felt most immediately. Heavy taxation bore down on villages, while new land settlements uprooted traditional rights. In Bengal, the permanent settlement had left farmers at the mercy of landlords. And in the north, systems like the Mahalwari forced peasants into cycles of debt. Famines became more devastating, not only because harvests failed, but because taxes rarely relented. To peasants who saw their grain taken away under company demand, British rule felt less like justice and more like extraction. Artisans, too, carried the scars of empire. Once Indian weavers had clothed Europe in muslin and silk. Now cheap machine-made cotton from Lancashire flooded the markets, undercutting their work. Towns that had thrived for centuries sank into poverty. Families who had passed down crafts for generations abandoned looms and dye vats, forced back into the soil as impoverished farmers. Prosperity seemed to drain out of India as steadily as the silver and textiles that filled British warehouses. Religion and culture provided another source of tension. While the company claimed neutrality, its policies often stirred suspicion. The presence of Christian missionaries, though never officially endorsed by the company, was seen as a sign that Britain intended to convert India. Social reforms, such as the abolition of sati and restrictions on child marriage, though celebrated in London, were received in India with unease. To many, these measures appeared not as compassionate reforms, but as assaults on sacred customs, the first steps in dismantling the very fabric of Indian society. Nowhere was resentment more concentrated than in the company's own army. The sepoys, numbering in the hundreds of thousands and drawn largely from the peasantry of Bengal, Awadh and the north, were the backbone of British power in India. Yet they often felt the sting of humiliation. Their pay lagged behind the rising cost of living. Promotions were restricted, and the cultural insensitivity of British officers bred mistrust. Orders that ignored caste and religious observances, such as forcing sepoys to serve overseas, which for many Hindus meant losing caste, deepened alienation. The spark, when it came, was small but symbolic. In 1857, the company introduced a new Enfield rifle. Its cartridges, soldiers were told, were greased with animal fat, rumored to be derived from cows, sacred to Hindus, and pigs, forbidden to Muslims. To load the rifle, sepoys had to bite the cartridges open, an act that violated both Hindu and Muslim religious law. Whether the rumor was entirely true mattered little. Belief itself was enough to ignite fury. For the sepoys, this was no longer just about pay or discipline. It was about faith, honor, and the suspicion that the British aimed to defile their religion as a prelude to conversion. But the cartridges were only tinder piled on years of resentment. Dispossessed princes, humiliated nobles, impoverished artisans, overtaxed peasants, all shared a growing sense of betrayal. India's old orders had crumbled, but the new one imposed by the company seemed not liberation, but bondage. The empire's strength, built on alliances and loyalty, now faced the risk of collapsing under the weight of its own insensitivity. By the spring of 1857, the whispers of discontent had grown louder. Villages murmured of rebellion. Sepoy lines were restless. Local rulers, displaced by British reforms, began to dream of restoration. The powder keg was ready. It only awaited a single spark to explode into the greatest challenge the company had ever faced, the uprising that would shake India and change the fate of the empire forever. The spark came at Meerut on May 10, 1857. A group of sepoys, humiliated and imprisoned for refusing to bite the new rifle cartridges, rose against their officers. Their anger, sharpened by years of grievances, erupted into violence. Within hours, barracks burned. British officers and their families fled in terror, and the mutiny spread like wildfire across northern India. What began as a local uprising quickly grew into something far larger, a rebellion that would shake the foundations of the East India Company's empire. The sepoys marched to Delhi, where their arrival electrified the city. There, in the crumbling Mughal court, they placed the aged Emperor Bahadur Shah the Sin, more poet than ruler, at the head of their cause. Suddenly a rebellion became a war of legitimacy. The Mughal banner, thought to be little more than a relic of the past, once again flew above Delhi's Red Fort. To rebels and supporters across the north, this was no mere mutiny. It was a call to restore a world swept aside by foreign rule. Across the Gangetic Plain, rebellion spread. In Kanpur, in Lucknow, in Jhansi, towns and villages erupted. Princes dispossessed by British annexation seized the moment to reclaim their thrones. Nobles rallied followers with promises of independence. Peasants joined in, striking at tax collectors and landlords who had enforced company demands. Women, too, stepped into the struggle. Most famously, Rani Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi, who donned armor, mounted her horse, and led troops in battle. To many Indians, she became the embodiment of resistance, fearless, defiant, unwilling to bow. But the rebellion was never unified. Each region, each leader, pursued their own aims. Some fought to restore the Mughals, others to revive Maratha power, others still simply to drive out the company. The lack of a common vision hindered coordination. Meanwhile, the British, stunned at first, regrouped with brutal determination. Reinforcements poured in by sea and overland. Telegraph wires, newly strung across India, crackled with messages that allowed Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay to coordinate their response with unprecedented speed. Railways moved troops to hot zones faster than rebels could march. The very tools of modernity that the British had introduced became weapons of suppression. The fighting was ferocious. Delhi became a cauldron of siege and slaughter, its streets echoing with cannon fire. At Kanpur, rebels massacred British captives, an act that hardened British resolve for retribution. In Lucknow, British garrisons endured desperate months under siege, their relief celebrated in London as a triumph of endurance. And in Jhansi, Lakshmibai fell in battle, remembered by both friend and foe as a warrior queen who fought to her last breath. The company's response was merciless. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were burned. Prisoners were executed by the hundreds. Entire regions were subjected to collective punishment. The British press spoke of vengeance, not justice. And in India, the memory of these reprisals left scars that would linger for generations. By mid-1858, the rebellion was crushed. Delhi was retaken, the Mughal emperor exiled to Burma, and rebel leaders killed or captured. Yet if the rebellion failed in its immediate aims, its legacy was immense. It shattered the illusion of stability under company rule, exposing how fragile its foundations truly were. It ended the Mughal dynasty, severing India's last symbolic link to its imperial past. And it forced Britain to reckon with a question that could no longer be ignored. Could India be ruled by a company whose pursuit of profit had driven millions into rebellion? The answer came swiftly. In 1858, the East India Company was dissolved. Its powers and territories were transferred directly to the British Crown. Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India, and governance passed into the hands of Parliament. The age of company rule was over. The age of the Raj had begun. The rebellion of 1857 had torn away the facade of stability. What followed was a reordering of the empire itself. In 1858, Parliament dissolved the East India Company, and India passed directly under the authority of the British Crown. The transfer wasn't just a change of management, it was a declaration that Britain's hold on India would henceforth be permanent, no longer the enterprise of a company, but the proud possession of an empire. Queen Victoria, in her proclamation of 1858, promised justice, protection of religious freedom, and equal treatment under law. These assurances were meant to calm a shaken land, to assure princes and peasants alike that Britain would rule not as a conqueror, but as a guardian. Yet beneath the words lay a new reality. India was now the jewel of Britain's imperial crown, and every aspect of its governance would be shaped to serve imperial needs. The Raj sought to project itself as modern, rational, and efficient. New systems of administration divided the subcontinent into presidencies and provinces, governed by viceroys and district collectors. The Indian civil service, staffed primarily by Britons, became the backbone of imperial authority, enforcing laws, collecting taxes, and managing courts. For Indians, advancement into these ranks was possible only for a select few, often educated in English schools and carefully vetted for loyalty. Technology became both a symbol and an instrument of imperial rule. Railways stretched across the plains, binding distant provinces to one another. To British eyes, they were proof of progress. To Indian critics, they were iron veins, draining resources outward, carrying cotton, grain, and opium to ports bound for Britain. Telegraph wires linked Calcutta, Bombay, and Delhi with astonishing speed, enabling governors to report to London in days rather than months. What had once been a distant colony now felt tethered to the imperial centre by invisible threads of communication. The military, too, was reshaped in the rebellion's aftermath. Distrust of sepoys lingered. and the British adjusted recruitment to favour groups they labelled as martial races, Sikhs, Gurkhas, Pathans, while reducing reliance on those who had joined the 1857 revolt. European officers held tighter command, and artillery, the decisive arm of the battlefield, remained firmly in British hands. The Raj would never again leave its security, so dependent on native soldiers. Culturally, the Raj presented itself as a civilizing force. Universities were established, laws codified, and English literature and science introduced into schools. Many Indians embraced this education, seeing in it new opportunities for advancement. A generation of reformers and thinkers would emerge from these classrooms, fluent in Shakespeare and Locke, yet deeply aware of their own heritage. For them, the English language became both a tool of subordination and, paradoxically, a weapon for resistance. Yet behind the veneer of progress lay contradictions. Railways that carried goods outward rarely carried prosperity back. Irrigation projects served cash crops more than subsistence farming. Courts enforced contracts, but often against debt-ridden peasants. And famine relief, when it came, was often too little, too late. To millions of ordinary Indians, the Raj didn't feel like benevolent rule. It felt like the tightening grip of a power that demanded loyalty, taxes, and obedience while offering little in return. Still, the Raj endured, projecting the aura of permanence. Ceremonial pageantry, the Durbar, the parade, the proclamation, wrapped the empire in the glow of majesty. Indian princes, many of them reduced to figureheads, were incorporated into this spectacle, dressed in jewels, riding in processions beside their British masters. It was a theatre of empire, designed to show that the Raj was not merely a regime, but an order ordained by history itself. But beneath the spectacle, the questions raised by 1857 lingered. Could India truly be governed in the interests of Britain without igniting further unrest? Could promises of justice coexist with the realities of exploitation? For now, the Raj stood triumphant, but its foundations were already marked by contradiction, and as the 1800s wore on, those contradictions would erupt again, not in open rebellion this time, but in the steady rise of an Indian national consciousness that would one day bring the empire to its knees. The British Raj was built on promises of order, progress, and prosperity. Yet for millions of Indians, the reality was one of hardship. Beneath the grandeur of imperial pageantry, the human cost of British rule was staggering, measured not in battles fought, but in crops diverted, industries dismantled, and lives lost to famine. The economy of India was systematically reshaped to serve the needs of Britain's industrial revolution. Cash crops took priority over food. Cotton, jute, tea, and opium were cultivated on a vast scale, filling the holds of ships bound for Lancashire mills and Chinese markets. Fields that once fed villages were now planted with crops that fed imperial profit. When harvests failed or markets collapsed, the consequences were borne not in London, but in India's villages. Famines became the recurring scourge of the Raj. In the late 1800s, waves of hunger swept across the subcontinent. The Great Famine of 1876-78 alone claimed millions of lives. Grain exports to Britain continued even as starving families wandered the countryside, their skeletal frames haunting eyewitness accounts. Relief, when offered, was meager, bound by rigid economic doctrines that prized balanced budgets over human survival. Officials, influenced by laissez-faire economics, feared that too much aid would disrupt the discipline of the market. The result was catastrophe on a scale that defies comprehension. For artisans, the costs were equally devastating. The decline of India's handloom industry wasn't simply an economic shift. It was a social collapse. Weavers in Dhaka, once famous for muslin so fine it was said to pass through a ring, saw their livelihoods vanish as British machine-made cloth flooded the markets. Entire families, once respected for their craft, fell into poverty. Stories spread, perhaps exaggerated but symbolic, that British policies had deliberately crippled Indian weaving by cutting off the thumbs of artisans. Whether literal or metaphorical, the image captured a painful truth. A civilization's skills were being broken to serve another's machines. Even for those who seemed to benefit, the cost was heavy. Indian princes, integrated into the spectacle of empire, lived in palaces gilded with British patronage, but their independence was a shadow of the past. They were expected to parade in durbars, sign treaties, and provide loyalty on command. Wealthy landowners profited from company rule and the Raj. Yet they too were bound to structures of taxation and dependency that enriched Britain far more than India. The psychological toll was harder to measure, but just as real. The people who had once lived under empires of their own, Mughal, Maratha, Sikh, now lived under the rule of distant strangers. The symbols of power, from the Union Jack flying above forts to the English language in courts, reminded Indians daily of subordination. And yet, within this humiliation, new seeds were planted. English education, meant to train loyal clerks, created a generation of thinkers who began to question empire in its own language. Newspapers, pamphlets, and public debates saw the first stirrings of nationalism. The British liked to call India the jewel in the crown. But for many Indians, it felt more like a shackle of iron. Progress, railways, telegraphs, courts was undeniable. But so, too, was the price paid in lives, livelihoods, and dignity. The human cost of empire was written not in ledgers, but in the silence of villages emptied by famine, in the broken looms of weavers, and in the muted voices of rulers reduced to ceremony. And yet out of this suffering resilience grew. The memory of famine fueled demands for reform. The erosion of old elites gave rise to new voices, and the contradictions of empire professing justice while practicing exploitation would awaken a national consciousness that no army of sepoys or regiments of redcoats could suppress forever. The story of Britain's conquest of India is not a tale of sudden collapse or a single decisive battle. It's the story of how a small island nation, armed with ships, silver, and shrewdness, took advantage of a fractured land and turned trade into an empire. The conquest was built not merely on muskets and cannons, but on alliances, betrayals, and the steady erosion of India's sovereignty. The decline of the Mughal Empire created the vacuum. The rise and fall of powers, like the Marathas, Mysore, and the Sikhs, revealed the potential for resistance, but also the cost of division. Where Indian rulers failed to unite, the company succeeded in exploiting their rivalries. The British didn't defeat a single India. They defeated many Indias one at a time, until none remained beyond their grasp. The East India Company perfected a new kind of conquest: corporate empire. It wielded account books as ruthlessly as bayonets, financing armies with the very revenues it extracted from the people it ruled. Bengal's riches bankrolled campaigns against Mysore, the Marathas, and Punjab. Trade and conquest fed one another in an unending cycle, until the company had transformed into something no one in 1600 could have imagined: a merchant guild ruling millions. But the empire came at a price. For Britain, India's wealth fueled the Industrial Revolution, made fortunes for merchants, and secured global supremacy. For India, the costs were borne in famines, economic disruption, and the loss of political independence. The jewel in the crown glittered brightly in London, but its brilliance was dimmed by the suffering of those who paid for it. And yet, from this darkness arose new light. The very tools Britain introduced, railways, education, newspapers, became instruments of resistance. English schools produced lawyers, journalists, and reformers who would one day use Britain's own ideals of liberty and justice to demand freedom. The trauma of 1857 lingered as a warning, but it also inspired a new generation of nationalists who saw clearly that empire was not destiny. The conquest of India thus offers enduring lessons. It reveals how fragile empires can be, how power can shift through betrayal as easily as through battle. It shows the cost of disunity in the face of foreign ambition, and it reminds us that the legacies of an empire are never simple. They're made of both railways and famines, both courts and chains, both education and exploitation. India wasn't conquered solely by Britain's strength. It was conquered by India's fragmentation, by the ambitions of merchants who became soldiers, and by the indifference of rulers who underestimated the reach of a trading company. But the empire, however mighty, could never extinguish the spirit of a people. In the long arc of history, British rule would be only a chapter in India's story, not its conclusion. For when the empire finally crumbled in the 20th century, it was India that endured. The land that had been called a jewel in another's crown reclaimed its own voice, its own destiny. The lessons of conquest became the foundations of independence, and the story of how Britain conquered India became ultimately a story of how India endured Britain.